I have been asked to share my thoughts, but to be very honest, the procedure will start officially within the committee and within Parliament at a later day or in a few days. It hasn't started officially. So what I will share is my personal thoughts and also thoughts that I have discussed with either other colleagues, other fellow MEPs, or even feedback that has already been provided by relevant and the different stakeholders. Of course, the thoughts that I will share are, let's say, a work in progress, so that they are not to be taken as the conclusive position, but they are work in progress because part of our work as members of the European Parliament is definitely to keep an open mind and to ensure that our policy and our legislation, our proposals will effectively address what needs to be addressed. I would say that one common element that has been, one common reaction that has been brought forward and has been expressed is that the Commission has identified the areas that correctly needs to be addressed. Therefore, that the Commission has identified the challenges that needed to be addressed. Even if some say these are modestly and not boldly addressed, but at least the areas and the challenges and barriers were correctly identified. One challenge that continuously keeps cropping up is that of freedom of panorama, and that this has been left out from the proposal. I believe this is something that we within the European Parliament will also be faced with. We seem to look at this proposal or at this challenge to bring copyright into the digital environment as being something about making sure that people can enjoy and access creative and cultural content in their digital lifestyles. It is also about facilitating the life of service providers to be able to provide access to content. But it is also about ensuring that while we enjoy and have access to content that exists, we can continue to invest in opportunities of having new content. And this by ensuring that lawful access to content, which of itself requires compensation, is also thought of. At the same time, there are public mission or public interest situations which do need to be taken into consideration. I think this is about how can we satisfy increased digital lifestyles with their demands for content and the different manners of consumption of that content. But we cannot stop at only addressing consumption patterns of content and forget about how technology and digital opportunities can help create and generate new content. Portability, addressing unjustified geo-blocking were the starting points. In addition, the exceptions for education and research, the increase in transparency for authors and creators and performers, the facilitation of licenses for service providers are also a good way forward. In the Parliament, we will have to deal with questions such as the following. Where does one reach a balance between commercial and non-commercial use for exceptions to be created? Or even, should we distinguish and treat commercial and non-commercial activities as both equally deserving the same intervention from the legislator? How far do we go towards empowering the original creator vis-à-vis others on the value chain? Are we really using the right medium to address challenges such as in the case of related rights for press publishers? These are all questions that we are already raising ourselves and that stakeholders too are raising, and therefore these will be crucial questions for Parliament to address when making its own proposals on this Commission proposal. But if I had to look at some of the specific proposals in the Commission document, and if I had to see, for example, how the Commission has tried to address research, education, and preservation of cultural heritage, I would say that there the Commission has obtained quite a good understanding of how digital technologies give new types of uses, and that we too want to give public mission-related stakeholders the possibility to take the opportunities that are made available to them. I often think that we shouldn't look at digital technologies as enemies of copyright and right holders, nor place them to be such, simply because the digital single market needs them both. The Commission proposal does bolster legal offer of content and thus try to unlock the digital potential of making content more available. Other questions that will surely be quite hot questions to be debated in the European Parliament is where do we use or why do we use exceptions for non-commercial purposes but not for commercial purposes, especially when the digital single market is all about the unleashing of commercial growth. The TDM exception can be seen as giving a good push forward, however, for investing in early research, which is already carried out with great and severe difficulties by universities or even in public-private partnerships. Non-commercial, if you have a look at the proposals, non-commercial is not necessarily related to funding manner, nor necessarily related to the making of revenues, the generating of revenues. In fact, if we look at the education exception, it is clearly stated that the structure and funding method is not to be considered. If we look at the digitalization projects of heritage institutes, the proposal clearly states that these will continue to remain to be able to generate reasonable revenues to cover costs. So in reality, we do have to consider how to make this distinction between commercial and non-commercial uses a bit more clear. Even when we consider the TDM exception, this also includes some commercial purposes through the PPPs, but the exceptions themselves are themselves intervening in cases which are not very close to market commercialization procedures. When we look at the exception of education, I think we would all agree in this room that education is an aspect which is of European priority. We would all agree that most of our member states are trying to address not just the skills gap between that we have in e-skills, but also trying to make education possible across borders. And we have seen a number of education stakeholders who have taken up this challenge seriously. But in them taking up that challenge, they are faced with a barrier of copyright, especially when the content they would like to use to facilitate and support their teaching and learning processes face unclear or lack of clarity in copyright regulations. I think with the creation of the legal presumption that is proposed in this proposal, this should put the lack of clarity, should bring the lack of clarity at an end. I believe that the creation of this legal presumption will, in fact, provide our educators, be they public or private educators, the possibility of taking European education a step further, also across borders. If we had to look at the paragraphs, the articles which refer to on-demand services, or even the paragraphs which deal with cultural heritage institutions, I think these two show a drive forward. The drive forward to make sure that content is available. And by making content available, especially to on-demand service providers, we are at the end trying to make more content lawfully available also to the people. There is a bit of a concern that I've been hearing repeatedly in the corridors, and this concern relates to user-generated content. Of course, user-generated content cannot be stopped because it is directly an attack on digital lifestyles. There is doubt that content recognition technologies informing right holders of user-uploaded content is going to work much, considering the already immense volume of user-generated content, and that this is expected to increase. So while discussion is centered around what can we do to address the value gap, at this point it is likely to move towards whether the proposed method reaches the right balance. The transparency element being proposed for authors and performers for exploitation and remuneration of their works is certainly most welcomed. as this can help empower authors and performers and creators in a digital environment without having too much interference by the legislator. A final word on the Marrakesh Treaty. I believe everyone knows that the European Parliament has been in favor of making content, cultural and creative content, easily accessible to visually impaired persons. The Parliament has repeatedly expressed its support for the Marrakesh Treaty to become a legislative obligation also on all our member states, and therefore the Commission will find the Parliament's, I would assume, full support in this respect. I think those were just a couple of thoughts that have been running through the corridors in my mind, but also of the European Parliament. But once again, these are not conclusive thoughts. And the discussion is ongoing. The discussion has started. The discussion will continue to proceed, and we will continue to discuss all the issues that need to be discussed. Thank you.
Hello? Yeah. So we have 10 more minutes. Is there anything that you want to say?
Is there one thing?
10 minutes. Yes. Okay.
Hello? Can you hear me? Yes. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Libor Manda. I'm from Seznam.cz, Czech search engine and digital services provider. And my question is there any particular future plans, regulatory ones in connection to search engines? I mean the question of snippets in general search results and so on, because now seeing the copyright package, we are afraid that it will move to this question as well, to this issue as well.
Sorry, I didn't get the question. Can you explain it a bit better?
Yes. If you have any plans regarding the copyright issue for search engines, I mean like the issue of snippets in general search results. If you see them as a copyright issue or not.
Well, you know, well, I don't know to what extent the question is copyright relevant for the snippets. There is a general reflection on the platforms, so the role of the platforms in the digital single market, and of course the search engines are part of it. Are you referring to the publishers' related right in relation to snippets? What is your concern in particular?
In general search, in the search box, if you put the keyword and then you get the result from the search, and there are also, of course, issues which are on the copyright, like the snippets and parex from new services. If you consider these results, these snippets as copyright issues, so if we are about to pay for these snippets showing in general search results based on keywords we put or the users put in the search box.
Well, I mean, these are the gist of the reform. So, as I said, for the publishers' related rights, is to make sure, and it is fully in line also with the the most recent case law of the Court of Justice, is to make sure that if you have a commercial website which uses basically content, so protected content of press publishers, belonging to press publishers, that the press publishers will have a say on how this content is used, and they may require a remuneration, so a fair remuneration. Now, for these snippets, I really don't know, because this will be very, very short snippets, so I don't know to what extent they are even covered by copyright. Something which I have not said, but it has been said ad nauseum and repeated ad nauseum so far, is that there will be no hyperlink tax in the reform, and that the reform in no way will, because we are not extending the scope of application of the copyright, we are not changing the exceptions under the copyright directive. So the reform will in no way undermine or affect the way, for example, individual consumers and users share hyperlinks or share information online. Would you like to chip in on?
I think this is what I was going to say, that hyperlinks have been removed. I mean, it could be that some people are still thinking of the document that was leaked, but there was a change between that document and the final document. And the final document specifically identifies hyperlinks as not being touched by this Commission proposal. But something that is a bit worrying, and I would say this is more of a concern even to the legal profession, is that when we speak of snippets and referencing and linking and making available of copyrighted content online, then even the judgments of the court could be very difficult to understand, the tests there. If your question was whether the Commission wanted to address the use of snippets online, I don't think this proposal really addresses that or affects the use of snippets in any way.
Yes, please. Can you?
Thank you very much, Emmanuel Forrest, representative of TF1, the first TV channel. I have just a naive question about the compatibility between our business model, genuine business model, and the first objective of the first item, which is to provide people with cross-border access to catch-up TV, for instance. Our business model is to sell to advertisers advertising slots. And the experience proves that these advertisers do not require, there is no demand for pan-European advertising slots. For instance, we have also in the group Bouygues Telecom. We are a French telecom operator, and they don't want to advertise in Slovakia, Poland, or anywhere. So we get money from the advertisers to buy or to produce contents for the French market, and we have not enough money to buy the rights for the whole territory of the European Union. So, in fact, when you consider the relevant market, which is the advertising market, there is no failure on the single market because there is no demand for pan-European advertising. And how would it be compatible with the fact that we should provide access to catch-up TV for content for which we didn't acquire the rights for Europe, since there was no demand for that from our clients, which is the advertiser?
I don't need it. I have the microphone. But so just maybe a clarification. The aim of the first pillar of the copyright is to ensure, which is also the first pillar of the DSM, is to ensure that citizens and business have enhanced access across border to content. To digital services, for example, and to, in the case of copyrights, to protected content. So what we are doing, simply, we are not dictating any particular business model. I don't think that I don't think there is even an unintended consequence of our regulatory approach. What we are doing is that for the ancillary services, we are making the life of the broadcasters easier. So we are driving down their costs, and we are getting them an additional incentive on the basis of the country of origin to reach out to more people. So yesterday, for example, we had a long discussion during the panel on whether the country of origin will destroy business models of the film producers. I really don't think so, because after all, what we are doing, more people, if the country of origins, if the mechanism works, and the same considerations are valid for collective management. If the mechanism works, it means that more people will be reached out, so more people will consume videos, this will generate more revenues, and the film producers will be, well, you may say no, but it is highly highly disputable. And the same thing applies to the applies to the cable-like TV services. So the clearing of the rights for the aggregation is a nightmare, is a real nightmare. So what we are trying to do is that we are trying to simplify the life of these people to the benefit really of the digital single market, because these people will be confronted with one interlocutor only and not a sort of myriad of interlocutors, which is gonna, which is a little bit the negation of the digital single market, in my opinion.
There's also a side aspect which your question has reminded me of, and that is providing access to content to minorities or to small populations. If what you're saying is, well, this all depends, access to these minorities or access to small populations, all depends on whether our advertisers want to advertise in those communities, then that raises questions of itself. So yes, I do understand that commercial entities are there to make profits and to generate revenues. But I think as policymakers, we do have to take on the general picture, especially if we are speaking of a digital single market, which should address also the cultural diversity and the linguistic diversity, of which we are so proud within the European Union.
Sorry, I encourage you to be continent because we don't have a lot of time. So I would say, three more questions? 3 more questions, please. There is the lady who decides.
Hi, and thanks for your answer to the TF1 question. I just have a follow-up question on that. Your answer seems to imply that the regulation is not forcing but just facilitating rights clearance for broadcasters, and that there is still contractual freedom to take into account business models, such as the advertising one that TF1 was describing. But of course, if we look at the regulation in a vacuum, that is true. But we know that at the same time, DG Comp is enforcing competition law in the same area in a way that might end up with a very limited contractual freedom to decide whether or not you will actually want to offer on a cross-border basis as a broadcaster. And I was reading the impact assessment, and there it explicitly said we are not looking at the enforcement of competition law while we're doing this impact assessment, because it is unsure what the outcome is. So we are just looking at the effects on the market, not taking into account the application of competition law. But can you really do that? Is that really realistic to look at the regulation in a vacuum like that without looking at the effects it might actually create in the wider picture of European law?
Well, if the Commission had to take every imponderable also thing into account when making a proposal, the life of the European regulator would be impossible. It would be completely stifled. So we have to consider, but we have to consider that our proposal, without speculating on what can be the result of the investigation carried out by DG Comp. So we've been, as you quite rightly say, we are not calling into question the contractual freedom of the parties. So the parties will still retain, so the right holders will still retain the possibility to withdraw the license, to renegotiate the license, to opt out. Our measure is a liberalization measure, is a measure which will drive the cost for a large chunk of the industry, and I think is something which needs to be supported. Also, because it goes hand in hand with the other proposal, which is the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which is based exactly on the same principles. So it cannot be that wrong after all. Sorry, there was someone else who wanted to ask for the floor. Sorry, and you wanted to say something. And so on.
Okay, thank you. My name is Ola Stockman from IFRA. And I just wanted to say first that I wanted to give credit to the Commission for the papers and the documents that they have submitted, because they are factual and they are also trying to understand, at least in our sector, and to build on and strengthen mechanisms and systems which are already in place and try to favor them. That goes for education, that goes for how the commerce works, even if there are certain things that we would also want to see differently. But I think those are nuances that we can come back to and that we can do and can discuss further later on. Among this, it's also important, one article that you didn't mention in your presentation, and that is Article 12, which guarantees that both authors and publishers can be remunerated for collective management and the collective management schemes administered by RROs, which is an important element in preserving those structures. My question is rather, and also on cross-border issues, I think that they actually goes to and reflects the state of the art as they are today, actually, and they make them legal. My question is it possible for you to say a little bit more about the process? Because you were very short on the process, and especially the process that you expect in the Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you for your words of encouragement, which we need. On the process, there is a little bit of a crystal ball exercise. So meaning that feel free to compliment and then chip in any time, but basically it's the co-legislation process. So you have a lecture, you have a first reading, which is carried out simultaneously in Council and Parliament. In Council you have a working group, which is the IP, Intellectual Property Working Group, which looks after the package. In Parliament, well, you are much better placed than me, there will be a rapporteur who will be appointed, there will be a parliamentary committee who will follow the work, will be the leading committee and who will follow the work, and then basically the Commission will intervene as a sort of honest broker in the process, defending the proposal, of course, and try and create convergence between the positions of the two co-legislators. So if everything goes, so if we are optimistic and everything goes fine, everything will be finished off in one reading, which will culminate in a trilogue, so in a meeting which will comprise of the Parliament, the Council, and the European Commission. If not, there will be a second reading, which will take much longer.
I didn't focus on this process because it is the normal process for any Commission proposal or for most Commission proposals. The lead committee in Parliament on copyright-related issues would be the Legal Affairs Committee, of which I am a full member. And we do expect to start working on this pretty soon, at least in a formal manner. But that does not mean that our members have not already started discussing this. We've been discussing this really focused on specific measures for at least since the own initiative report that we had, I believe, last year on exactly the copyright directive itself. But otherwise, it's the normal procedure, the normal legislative procedure that is already established.
Thank you. So we already run a little bit behind schedule. What I encourage you to do is that, I am relatively new to the job, so I've taken over the file very recently, but I'm open-minded. I am now based in Brussels because I moved from Luxembourg, so you give me a ring, we fix an appointment, and you will explain, so you will provide the litany of all your arguments, and be assured that you will find a very receptive interlocutor. Would you like to say something else?
No, just thank you for everyone for your participation, and also thank you for for providing us as members of the Parliament with information on your experiences.